There are two types of MVC frameworks, configuration-based and convention-based. Configuration-based frameworks work from a config file. The model's views and controllers are connected together by some sort of configuration file, maybe an XML file or a giant switch case statement somewhere in the code. ColdBox is a convention-based framework. These also have models, views, and controllers, but instead of using a config file to connect them together, everything works off naming conventions. By all the files, folders, and methods being named with the same convention, they get magically glued together by ColdBox with no extra configuration required by you. Let's take a look at some of the things that were generated for us by the ColdBox create app command we learned earlier. We got an entire working ColdBox application, and the folders and files that were generated for us will be the start of our sample application. These naming conventions will be pretty much identical in whatever other ColdBox apps you work on in the future, so it's good to have an understanding of which things live where in your application. As you can see, our models folder currently doesn't have anything of importance in it. We'll add some code in here as we develop our application in later videos. Basically, here's where your SQL code will live, and the majority of other business logic functionality for your app as well. Views are part of the application that you view, the things that actually appear in the web browser. Your HTML, CSS, and JavaScript would all go in the views. Technically, this folder will probably be nothing but CFML files, but as you can see, those files will mostly contain nothing but HTML, CSS, bits of JavaScript, and maybe some tiny bits of CFML for a little UI logic. We'll get into more details about what the views do in a later video. We mentioned MVC stands for Model View Controller, and we've seen the model and view folders already for our application. So where's the controllers folder? In ColdBox, it's actually named handlers, but everything in the handlers folder is the same as what would go in a controllers folder in other MVC frameworks. It's only called handlers because the Java-based frameworks that helped to inspire ColdBox, those things used the term handlers, so the name got carried over into ColdBox as well. The handlers folder pretty much just has CFCs in it. The methods in the CFCs are the names of the different events in your application, and that's how ColdBox does pretty much everything. Here's a URL for our app. See how the event variable in our URL has main.index? There's a main CFC in our handlers folder, and inside there is an index method. These things correspond with the parts of the URL. Main in the URL corresponds to the main CFC in your handlers, and the index part of the URL, .index, corresponds with the .index method here in our handler. After the main .index method runs, ColdBox will go into the views folder we saw earlier, find the main subfolder, and it will look in the index file in there to load that for our web page. Here's views, mains, index. You don't have to configure anything to make the URLs match up with the methods in the CFCs and the items in the views folder. As long as you're consistent with the naming conventions, everything just magically works because of how ColdBox does things internally. Let's look at our view again for a page on our application. Notice how this isn't a complete web page. The stuff you'd usually find at the top of a file for like a site header and the things at the bottom for like a site footer, those are all missing. There's no site navigation, the title tag isn't here, the site footer tag is missing, and so on. Also, any scripts or link tags for JavaScript and CSS, those are also gone. There's also no CF includes or custom tags that might add those things into this template. So how does our view get those items and become a complete web page? The layouts folder in your ColdBox application contains the markup that sort of wraps your page content, provides the site header and footer, and does the including of JavaScript and CSS files. We'll get into the details of how layouts work in a later video, but for now, know that that's how it works. Your various site header and footer items and things like that live in this folder, your layouts, and actual page-specific items will live in your views folder. ColdBox wires the layout and views together before rendering any content out to the web browser itself. Earlier, we said ColdBox is a convention-based framework, and that it's not a configuration-based framework that relies on config files to run. That's not to say there's no way to configure ColdBox. It's just that the basic machinery for MVC activities doesn't have to be manually written out by developers in some sort of XML file or the like. All the application settings inside ColdBox come with working defaults. meaning you don't have to edit any sort of configuration at all to get your sample app up and running. It will work out of the box with no changes needed. If you do want to change settings and customize the app, look inside the config folder, and that's where you'll go to tweak different application settings. Coldbox CFC is sort of the main place for what I'd call general application settings. Essentially, most of the things you'd find in an application CFM file, if this were a legacy CFML app, you'd find those in Coldbox CFC. As you can see, this file already has several dozen settings in it. These were all created with the Coldbox Create app from before. They all work as is, and you don't need to change any of them to start the application. We'll cover what these settings do in more detail in a later video, but for now, you can just see that it's in here. There's really no functionality in this file either. It's just a lot of variables set to different default values. For instance, environments development is set to localhost and 127.0.0.1. Layout settings has a couple of values inside it. And way up at the top, there are some other settings you might find similar versions of in a legacy application. Default event, missing template handler things, stuff for your layouts and views, and so on. Taking that a few steps farther, we've got Router CFC, which can be used to customize the URLs in your application, provide custom URL formatting, and basically add similar functionality to your app's URLs. Wirebox.csc is for managing dependency injection and aspect-oriented programming, or AOP, functionality in your application. Dependency injection in itself can be a strange concept to grasp. We'll get into the details of that concept and how Wirebox works in a later video. But for now, know that you get Wirebox functionality in your Coldbox app automatically. Also, this is totally optional, so if you're just not a fan of DI or AOP for some reason, they're totally optional when building your apps. We'll help you get more comfortable with those concepts later in this video series. And finally, we have CacheBox CFC. This is used for controlling the cache providers in your application. Again, this is also optional and doesn't have to be configured in order for your application to run. The general idea with CacheBox is when you do want to add a cache provider to your system, such as EHCache or Memcache, CacheBox makes doing so pretty seamless. There are two other folders to show you as well, modules and modules_app. They're both essentially empty now. They do similar jobs with one difference. In Coldbox, your application can also have sub-applications that work alongside it. For example, maybe my app needs a rather involved security system for managing accounts, which types of users have which permissions, resetting passwords, making sure the passwords are encrypted, and so on. Perhaps my company has 10 different applications that all need the same type of functionality. Rather than rebuilding that code 10 times for each app, I can write a Coldbox app that just deals with user security and permissions, and then I can reuse that application across each of my 10 projects. That's possible with Coldbox modules. These are essentially self-contained Coldbox applications that can be added inside other Coldbox applications to give them additional functionality without needing to do any customization work. You simply install Coldbox modules into your application and you're done. These modules I mentioned live inside either the /modules folder or the modules app folder. So what's the difference in the two? We talked about ForgeBox earlier and the NPM style registry that stores CFML applications for developers to reuse, forgebox.io. If you install a Coldbox module from ForgeBox, it will be added inside the /modules folder automatically for you. Now let's say you want to write your own module, but it's not stored on ForgeBox. Perhaps this is a private module that's super customized and really only works for applications within your company's intranet. You can write your own custom modules just like that for any other Coldbox applications. Instead of putting these modules inside the /modules folder from where things from ForgeBox live, you simply put them in the modules_app folder to keep them separate from the items that ForgeBox controls. We'll get into the details of how to use modules of both kinds later on in this course, but for now, know that that's the only difference in these two folders. Modules is for items from forgebox.io, and modules apps is for modules that you yourself, your development team within your company build and add to your applications separate from the items that ForgeBox controls. One last thing before we wrap up this video. Let's look at the event in our application and give a quick walkthrough of how the execution conventions we mentioned earlier behave in our application, so you can see how the machinery of all the different sections is wired together. This is a standard Coldbox URL. It will always go to the index.cfm file, and it will always have an event URL variable. This one is main.index. The first thing that happens here is Coldbox looks in our handlers folder, finds our main CFC and finds the index method inside that CFC and runs it. After the handler is finished, the layout and view get processed. Views have the same naming convention as our handler, main.index. So in the views folder, we have a specific main subfolder, and inside there is an index.cfm view that renders our page-specific content. For the site header and footer kind of stuff, we've got our layouts folder. Instead of the main.index style naming convention we saw before, here it's just main, as you don't usually have a different layout for each page in your site. Most likely there's only one layout for everything, maybe with slight differences based on if the user is or is not logged in. So we just have a main site level file here, or section level file naming convention. There's no limit to how many handlers, views, or layouts you can have. It all just depends on what functionality you want to build into your application and how big of an imagination you have when doing so. Right now you can see I've got one handler with several different methods in it. We'll describe what each of those do later. I've got one views folder with one subfolder inside it and two views. We'll get into more detail about what these do later as well. And you can see I have one layout that just has everything in it for every page on our application. And again, later on in this video series, we'll show you how to add different layouts for different sections of larger applications as you build them.